Tonight, John's topic is recent findings on the origin of Islam, a key to countering radicalism, question mark.
Thank you very much, everybody. I want to start by just making an opening remark. The nature of Islam and its role in modern society is the subject of widespread confusion. I would say that never in history has such an issue of such critical importance been the subject of so much confusion for so long by so many. That's my view, and I'll come back to that. In this lecture, I would like to express my views and at other times express the views of other people who are experts in this field. And I'll try to distinguish when I'm doing either of those things. Firstly, I would like to address the Muslims who may be aware of this lecture. I do not bear any malice towards you. I sympathise with you in many ways. I recognise that you have been and are victims of injustice and prejudice. I regret that. However, I am an atheist, and of course I will criticise what you believe. I recognise that your beliefs may be a part of your culture and your identity, and may be deeply held and felt. But these beliefs are your choice. There is no compulsion in religion, perhaps. But no one can control what you think in your own mind. Die Gedanken sind frei. It's up to you. When you identify yourself as a Muslim, you are expressing your allegiance to the religion and to some extent to the ideology that it represents. You cannot escape that. Of course, everything is subject to interpretation, but you are either a Muslim or you are not. Hence, I hope you will be able to consider what I have to say as a legitimate point of view, although one that you might not agree with. On the issue of interpretation and the possible reform of Islam, Maajid Nawaz is a key protagonist, and I would like to express my complete support for him and what he hopes to achieve. I wish him the best of luck. On the issue of de-radicalisation, I would like to express my support for the process of Socratic questioning. By asking questions, we help clarify thinking. Doubt is not an obstacle, but a source of knowledge. While many de-radicalisation programs work on aspects of community involvement and alienation reduction, I do think there is a role for street epistemology, as it's called. As Peter Boghossian has said most pertinently, those who have more doubt about their beliefs are less likely to act on them. And as we shall see, there is a lot which could be doubted. In this lecture, I will be outlining views and findings as facts as best we can determine them. I hope that those who are less disposed to accepting them as such will at least be able to accommodate the views as questions that perhaps need research and investigation. Now, I'd like to go back to my opening remark about the importance of this issue and what I see as the huge confusion surrounding it. I have taken an interest in this issue since September 11, and my concern is a humanitarian one. The dominance of a religion in society affects its institutions, which in turn affect its economic and social outcomes. More than a decade ago, the United Nations Human Development Reports indicated that Arab countries were underperforming on a whole range of indicators. The causes of this underperformance were all related or associated with Islam. In those countries, the situation is immeasurably worse now. Consider these trends. Over recent decades, these are good trends to start with, even the poorest countries, life expectancy has increased, infant mortality has decreased. The United Nations Millennium Development Goal on poverty to reduce by half the number of people living on less than $2 a day was achieved. There are more people now, less poor, more healthy, and living longer than ever before. But at the same time, the level of conflict has increased in many countries. Some are ravaged by conflict and have disintegrated into failed states. I could mention Iraq and Syria. We could also add Yemen and Libya. Before that, we could think of Somalia. There's many countries in West Africa that are not in a healthy state of peace and prosperity. All of these countries I've mentioned are Islamic countries. Millions of children have not been, since the conflicts, millions of children have not been in school, and their lives have been traumatized by homelessness and violence. There are now more refugees than at any time since the Second World War. These outcomes are a direct consequence of the type of societies that Islamic ideology creates and the type of behaviours it fosters. The basic problem is the elevation of Islamic law above all else. Islam, in many respects, is a humanitarian disaster. And for this and so many other reasons, including the subjugation of women, which I could elaborate on. Some people may disagree with that, but I would encourage them to study the situation more carefully. And those who suffer the consequences of Islam, which I allude to, are the Muslims themselves, more than any other people. I'll go further than that. Earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods all cause human suffering. But earthquakes last for seconds or minutes. Hurricanes may last for hours. Floods may last for days. After that, rebuilding and recovery may begin. But the suffering caused by Islam-inspired conflicts lasts for years, with no end in sight and no rebuilding yet possible. This is far worse than any natural disaster. Islam is the greatest cause of human suffering in the world today. This seems to have escaped people's notice, which is why I'm not trying to make a point of the importance of this issue. It is a very important issue, hence the basis for my remark. Now, despite the arguments I've made, I have been personally ridiculed and slandered, in fact, for making a statement such as that. as a critic of Islam, and despite explaining my humanitarian concern as the basis of it, and despite my particular concern to be critical of Islamic beliefs but not to denigrate Muslims as people, I have yet been accused of bigotry, hate-mongering, racism and prejudice. Not so much by Muslims. This criticism comes almost entirely from my fellow free thinkers. You might find it hard to believe, but that is exactly the case. As a secular party representative, I am constantly self-constrained by what I may say. It's a phenomenon that Majid Nawaz calls the regressive left. Christianity may be criticised, but Islam may not. Now, I'd like to refer to a couple of incidents. For example, on the occasion of the Lint Cafe incident in Sydney, in which the perpetrator tried to create as much terror as possible, had fake bombs all over the place, designed the place so he could get maximum news coverage, had an Islamic flag with the Shahada on it. As a response to that, the Secular Party issued a press release saying that we regret this terrorism attack, but religion is the problem and secularism is the solution. That was all we said. As a result of that, we had an uproar. Many people resigned from the party. There was so much bad criticism on Facebook and what have you. We apparently should not say that. We should not criticise Islam in that way. It was simply drawing attention to the problem, and I sincerely believe that secularism is the solution to this problem. We need to have freedom of religion, but freedom from religion, especially in our constitutions. I will give you another example, and this may also surprise you. In a recent discussion in a group of free thinkers, I was so astounded by the nature of the points that were made that I made a mental note of them and wrote them all down. And this is what was put to me in this discussion. The ideology of Islam is irrelevant. Islamic terrorism is not related to Islam. The disintegration of Middle Eastern countries into failed states has nothing to do with Islam. Most refugees are not caused by Islam. Islam is no different or worse than any other religion. Islam is not the cause of human suffering, or at least not in the top 10. Islam is not a problem that needs any solution. IRA terrorism is equivalent to Islamic terrorism. Male circumcision is equivalent to FGM. Islam has merit because it causes charity, provides charity. Information about Islam is not required in order to understand it, and my so-called obsession with Islam is motivated by prejudice. Now, all of those propositions are utterly preposterous, and I can't imagine why. I sincerely cannot understand what is in people's minds when, particularly if they're atheists, they act as an advocate or an apologist for Islam in this way, and not in a way that would apply to any other religion. So hypocrisy is the least word I could use to describe that. I have said this before, but people with these attitudes have a blatant disregard for the suffering that Islam causes. If you want to advocate on behalf of Islam, you are actually working against the best interests of those people who are suffering from it, and particularly atheists themselves, many of whom are persecuted, many of whom have suffered death, if not severe punishment. Why? Why? And also in helping to defend Islam, you're working against all of the ex-Muslims and all of the people who are trying to solve this problem. So that is the nature of why I said there's such confusion about this issue. That's not the only reason, though. Well, the perception, I think what's going on is the perception is that Muslims here are a minority that needs to be protected. We need social harmony, and I can understand that. But this must not be at the expense of recognition of the true nature of the problem. Otherwise, we are doomed to fail. The rise of right-wing parties and loony populists, you must know who I mean, is a direct result of the failure of the mainstream to address this issue. And I might add that now opinion polls show that half the population wants to stop Muslim immigration, which is an absurd policy. You can't implement that policy because, first of all, it might keep out the people that are suffering, and how do you actually identify that? So, if we're going to look at immigration, we should specify the type of values that we expect from our immigrants, and something that we actually already do. So that's the way to look at that issue. I think I was saying that the most significant source of confusion, is about the nature of Islam itself. This aspect of the confusion applies to both Muslims and non-Muslims. According to its own doctrines and history, Islam is a jihadist religion. The Prophet Muhammad was a jihadist. This is the most important and most relevant single aspect about the religion. How can this have escaped people's notice? Note, I am not saying from that all Muslims are jihadists. Obviously not. I'm talking about the doctrines of the religion itself, which I'm going to elaborate on. These issues are important, and what I will cover in the rest of this talk is not my opinion, which it has been more or less up till now, but is the considered opinion of many experts who have devoted their lives to the reasoned study of Islam. And I should mention some of the people, and I've put on display here some of the works of these scholars, and they're very erudite publications, and I've in fact read most of them at least once. Research in the 19th century was done by an Austrian scholar, Sprenger, who uncovered the biography of Muhammad. Goldseer, in the same century, did particular research. Another one was Joseph Schott, and they uncovered the unreliability of the hadith. John Wansborough was a significant figure who identified the origin of Islam as from the Arab Empire. Patricia Croner, who recently died, established there were no records that showed Mecca as a centre of trade. More recent authors include Volker Popp, Karl-Heinz Oleg, Ibn Warwick and Christoph Luxemburg. The last of those two write under false names for their own safety and protection. All of these people have meticulously researched the original texts in the Arabic. Volker Popp is a numismatist, which is an expert on coins. And he is able to infer much about the power relations in early Islam from interpretation of the coins and inscriptions. The coins have the power, show the leader on the coin. They show, the nature of the coin shows the power that pertained at the time, and the coins are dated. So they are significant evidence of what's going on at the time. And he has some very significant findings from that. The most accessible starting point I can recommend for this is the TV documentary produced by Tom Holland and shown on BBC4 some years ago, never shown here. It was called In Islam, the Untold Story. And you can find it online, download it and watch it, or watch it online. And Tom Holland's book, The Shadow of the Sword, is a very interesting and entertaining account of the history. The sources on which all of this research is based, I'll come to that in a second. Now I'm just going to start relating what another author, Robert Spencer, has provided, and his work, which is in the book Did Muhammad Exist?, is really a synthesis of the research of all the other books, or quite a lot of the other books. So it's a summary of the other books and brings together their findings and systematically reviews that in relation to the standard canonical story of Islam. A thorough review of the historical record shows that much, if not all, what we know about Muhammad is legend and not historical fact. The Quran is not a revelation from the one true God, but was actually constructed from already existing material, mostly from the Jewish and Christian traditions. Both Judaism and Christianity have been the subject of widespread scholarly investigation for more than 2 centuries. Not Islam. Can Islam survive this historical challenge? Now, the main historical sources are the Quran itself, the Hadith, and the Sirah. The Hadith literally means reports, which are the collections of Muhammad's words and deeds and form the basis of Islamic law and practice. The Hadith are hugely voluminous and date from a period considerably after Muhammad's reported death in 632. The Sirah, the biography of the Prophet of Islam, was written by Ibn Ishaq, who died in 773, was written at least 120 years after the death of his protagonist. There is little doubt about the unification of Arabia that took place around the time of Muhammad is assumed to have lived. Scholars generally agree that the Arabian warriors swept out of Arabia, beginning in the second quarter of the 7th century, and within 100 years had subdued much of the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and had entered India and Spain. A very rapid expansion of the Arab Empire. The name Muhammad, now we'll talk about the Quran in particular. The name Muhammad appears in the Quran only 4 times, and in those instances it is used as a title, the praised one or the chosen one, rather than as a proper name. The use of the term Muhammad as an honorific, that is a title, predates Islam by a very long time. And Volker Popp has provided very early evidence of the use of the term Muhammad in this way. It wasn't the name of someone until much later. By contrast, in the Quran, Moses is mentioned by name 136 times and Abraham 79 times. Even Pharaoh is mentioned in the Quran 74 times. Meanwhile, the Messenger of Allah appears in various forms 300 times and Prophet 43 times. But the Quran also refers to Jesus as a messenger at 575. It is possible that when the Quran refers to Muhammad, meaning the praised one, it could be referring to Jesus. According to Spencer, only in one place in the Quran is he convinced, where it says Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, is it likely to actually refer specifically to the Prophet of Islam. Now, what I'd like to do next is just outline Islamic history according to the standard sources, the canonical version. There was an Arabian prophet of the Quraysh tribe of Mecca, known to the world as Muhammad, a name which means praised one. In the year 610, when he was 40, he was praying in a cave on Mount Hira, about 2 miles from Mecca, when he was suddenly confronted by the angel Gabriel, who commanded him to recite. For the next 23 years, until his death in 632, Muhammad recited the messages of Gabriel, presenting them to his followers as the word of God. After his death, the memorized revelations received were collected together into the Quran, meaning recitation. Muhammad's preachings were unpopular with the polytheistic Quraysh in Mecca and threatened their trade arising from the annual pilgrimage to the Kaaba. In 622, Muhammad left Mecca with his followers, the Muslims, and settled in the city of Yathrib. This emigration was called the Hijrah and marks the date of the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Yathrib became later known as the city of the Prophet, Medina. After his arrival there, Muhammad called on his followers to take up arms in defense of the community and subsequently to fight offensive wars against the non-believers. Muhammad himself led the Muslims into battle against the Quraysh and other pagan tribes. According to the story, after a series of battles, Muhammad was successful, defeated the Meccans and brought Islam to them and subsequently to all of Arabia. These battle stories illustrate the core of Islamic salvation theology, that obedience to Allah brings success and disobedience brings punishment. After Muhammad's death, his Muslim warriors were energized by the Prophet's exhortations to jihad and embarked on a series of conquests unprecedented in their breadth and swiftness. Syria and the Holy Land by 637, Armenia and Egypt by 639, Cyprus in 654, North Africa in the 650s and 660s, and by 674 the Muslims were threatening Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. A century after the death of the warrior prophet, they control a vast empire stretching across the Middle East and North Africa. That's the canonical story, and the conquest part of it is verified. And the rest of the story of Muhammad, that story is taken for granted by Muslims and mostly non-Muslims alike. However, it is clear that apart from the conquests themselves, virtually none of that standard account could have happened as stated. Here is what we know. No record of Muhammad's reported death in 632 appears until more than a century after that date. A Christian account, apparently dating from the mid-630s, speaks of an Arab prophet armed with a sword, but who is still alive. The early accounts written by the people the Arabs conquered never mention Islam, Muhammad, or the Quran. The conquerors are called Ishmaelites, Saracens, Mujhiran, and Hagarians, but never Muslims. The conquerors, in their coins and inscriptions, don't mention Islam or the Quran for the first 6 decades after their conquests. Mentions of Muhammad are non-specific and could refer to the praised one and honorific. On at least 2 occasions, inscriptions on buildings are accompanied by a cross. This is when they were supposed to be Muslims. The Quran, even by the canonical account, was not distributed in its present form until the 650s. Contradicting this, however, Arabs, Christians, or Jews never mention the Quran until the early 8th century. During the reign of Caliph Muawiyah, 661 to 680, he constructed at least one public building whose inscription was headed by a cross. When we begin hearing about Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and about Islam itself, is in the 690s, during the reign of Caliph Abd al-Malik. Abd al-Malik claimed to have collected the Quran. At this time, the governor of Iraq, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, distributes copies of the Quran to the provinces, something that Caliph Uthman is supposed to have done decades earlier. These are things we know. In the middle of the 8th century, the Abbasid dynasty supplanted the Umayyad line, the line of Abd al-Malik. The Abbasids charged the Umayyads with impiety on a large scale. In the Abbasid period, biographical material about Muhammad began to proliferate. The first biography of Muhammad then appeared 125 years after his reported death. The biological material that situates Muhammad in an area of Arabia that was never the centre of trade or pilgrimage that the canonical account depends on it to be. Tom Holland and others have elucidated exactly why they had to locate their sanctuary in Mecca. It was because it was a place that was definitely Arabian, and it was a safe place. It was beyond other armies from reaching. I should add to Spencer's account here that Volker Pop refers to inscriptions that refer to dates in the era of the Arabs. The Arab calendar does not date from the Hijra at all, but to a date in 622, when the Arabs first gained their independence from the Byzantine Empire. That was the start of the Arab calendar, which at that time was not a Muslim calendar. The lack of confirming detail and delayed development of the biography suggests that whatever Muhammad figure may have existed, he was quite different to what the legend portrays. So what really happened? The Arabs built a mighty empire. Every empire of that day had a political theology. The Christological controversies of the early church about the Trinity and so forth threatened to tear the Byzantine Empire asunder. 4 ecumenical councils, after 4, Christian groups that were regarded as heretical left the empire. And that included areas of Arabia, of Syria and Persia. The earliest Arab rulers appear to have been adherents of Hagarism, a monotheistic religion centered around Abraham and Ishmael. Hagar, by the way, was Abraham's concubine and the mother of Ishmael. Tom Holland makes a remark that it's ironic that the Muslims should be descended from Abraham via a female line and an illegitimate female line at that, because Hagar was a concubine, not a wife. The early Arab rulers frowned upon the Christian doctrines of Trinity and the divinity of Christ. Hence, Muawiyah's letter to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine calling on him to renounce Jesus and serve the God of Abraham. They regarded Christ as the servant of Allah and his messenger, but not as a god. That was their difference. They embraced Jesus as a prophet and had the crosses on their coins and inscriptions. They saw themselves as embracing both Judaism and Christianity. At what time did Muhammad become elevated in the religion? This all seems to have occurred around the turn of the century between 600 and 700. Abdul Malik's 691 inscription on the Dome of the Rock is an anti-Trinitarian treatise in which the word Muhammad likely refers to Jesus as the praised one. It says things such like, there is only one God but God, Muhammad is his prophet. But the Muhammad that is written there is certainly interpreted by many of these scholars as referring to Jesus, and there's a lot of arguments why they present that case, because it's anchored in Christian and anti-Trinitarian theology, and it was written on the Dome of the Rock. Now, this is probably the most contentious thing for Muslims, because they regard the inscription on the Dome of the Rock as being verification of the Quran itself, dating from that time. However, it's more likely that the inscription didn't come from the Quran came from the inscription. As the religion of Islam developed, the Dome of the Rock lent itself well to the adoption of a new Arab figure distinct from Jesus, and became identified with what was by then just rumours of an early Arab prophet. The concept of a legendary hero would be politically useful for a new Arab empire. The new prophet needed to be an Arab living deep in Arabia. He had to be a warrior prophet, for the new empire was aggressively expansionistic. This new prophet would have needed a sacred scripture to lend him authority. Much of the Quran shows signs of being borrowed from Jewish and Christian traditions, indicating the founders of Islam fashioned its scripture from existing material. An Islamic prophet and revelation was needed, but Abdul Malik and his fellow Umayyad caliphs were not centered in Arabia, but in Damascus. Hence, it is not surprising that Quran has many Syriac features and non-Arabic influences, as Christoph Luxemburg has elaborated. The Quran has furious warnings of judgment and Islamist exhortations, and holds Muhammad as an excellent example for all Muslims to follow, but has little detail of what the Prophet actually said or did. Hence, there's a huge need for such material. The great canonical hadith collections were all compiled in the 8th century after the Abbasids, or most of them, replaced the Umayyads. The minting of hadith proliferated. The Umayyads, Abbasids and Shiites all produced hadiths criticising the other factions and supporting their own factions. They needed to convince people that the stories of the Prophet and his new religion were not in fact new. The Abbasids blamed the Umayyads for not obeying the Prophet and for not being religious. The Abbasids then claimed credit for revealing the true nature of the Arab prophet. So that's the reconstruction of what actually happened according to many of the scholars and according to Spencer. This reconstruction explains the curious silence of the Arab conquerors about Muhammad and the Quran. It explains why Quran arrived on the scene long after the Arab conquests. Islam, by its nature, is a political faith. Unlike its Abrahamic forerunners, it considers its adherents as being instruments of divine justice on earth. The Quran prescribes agonizing punishments for disbelieving infidels and exhorts Muslims to wage war against those infidels, apostates, and polytheists. I'm quoting again back from Spencer here. The political, military, and imperial components are intrinsic to the Islamic faith, and they are evident from the earliest records. The alternative scenario explains the unique political nature of Islam. The theology was created to justify and to perpetuate the Arab Empire. There may have been an early prophet of the Arabs, but not one who received the eternal book from a supreme God. The details of Muhammad's life and his wives are a creation. The entire thing is a creation of political ferment dating long after the time that Muhammad was supposed to have lived. Records indicate strongly that the Quran as such did not exist until long after it was supposed to have been delivered. I could refer some further discrepancies about the dates there. Now, there's a lot of brave scholars who've put work into this research. This research has been applied to to Jewish and this sort of analysis has been applied to Jewish and Christian theology, but few have bothered really to consider the effects of the nature of Islamic theology on relating it to the early Arab Empire and, critically, to what we observe in the world today. It's no accident that, as Majid Nawad describes it, we are now witnessing a global jihadist insurgency. It can be traced directly to the scriptures themselves. As to the reasons why it's happening more now than before, we can talk about that, but what I think is most important is to recognise that it's not everything's a matter of interpretation. The documents of Islam are there. You can read them. You can see what they say. You can see what the Prophet did, including his 6-year-old wife and the beheadings he engaged in. It's no accident that people in the Islamic State follow this type of behaviour and other aspects. We need to look at what's motivating it first. Then we need to look at the actual historical basis on which all of this terrible turmoil is based. It's all coming from something that we actually know is entirely fabricated. I just hope that people eventually can realise that the truth matters. The truth is not an arbitrary construct. The truth is not simply what you want it to be. The truth should be something that's carefully considered, and people's beliefs should be based on a considered evaluation of the evidence. It was said that Islam was born in the full light of history. It wasn't, but now is the time to usher in some light on this subject, and it's a very important task that we do that. Thank you very much.